It's arbitrary but irresistible. I'm talking about giving new presidents a report card on their first 100 days in office. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Shots in arms, checks in wallets. Joe Biden delivered on both those goals quickly, a big vaccine rollout and a huge COVID relief bill. Now comes the hard part. Biden wants to pay for a massive public works and social spending bill with tax hikes on corporations and the wealthy. He's pledged to cut climate emissions in half. He weighed in on Derek Chauvin's conviction in the George Floyd killing, but he now has to deliver on reconciling racial justice and public safety. On the global stage, Vladimir Putin is talking tough about a Russian red line the West will regret crossing. And the intelligence community says China is the biggest threat to the US. So how does Biden manage that dicey relationship? It helps politically that the president's poll numbers are solid, a 52% approval rating in an ABC Washington Post poll. That's higher than Trump ever had, but lower than most presidents since Gerald Ford at this point. So how should we judge Biden's first 100 days? And what's the outlook for the Biden agenda? We're joined by Peter Baker, the Times' White House bureau chief, the author of The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker, Eleanor Randolph, a Times contributing writer and the author of The Many Lives of Michael Bloomberg. It's now in paperback. And Clyde Haberman, also a contributing writer for the Times. Peter, we're talking before the president's speech Wednesday night. What can we expect him to say, and how is that likely to affect his standing with the American public?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, President Biden ran as a candidate on the idea that he would be a transition figure, but he's actually governing as more of a transformational one. He's trying to, in effect, rewrite the social compact that we've had now basically for the last 30 years. Reversing the Reagan era view that government was the problem, not the solution, to try to make the case to the American public that government actually should take a much more activist, much more progressive role in society when it comes to social spending, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to wealth redistribution, in effect. The idea is that the last number of years, the rich have gotten richer and the rest have been left behind. He's going to, through the means of government instruments, taxation and spending, try to level that playing field as he sees it. But that's a big, big order. And he's got a very, very narrow set of majorities in the Congress. And whether his ability to actually execute this vast, ambitious agenda is possible is a very big question for the next 100 days and the 100 after that.
Eleanor, this was supposed to be Sleepy Joe, according to Donald Trump. He certainly awakened. He's awakened a lot of Americans. Is this the president you expected him to be?
No, not, I didn't expect Sleepy Joe. I knew that he knew the system in Washington, and he realizes probably more than any other president that he has 2 years. He's got the Senate and the House, just barely has the Senate and has the House, and no telling what's going to happen in 2022 in the midterm elections. So this is the moment, and he has really been steaming ahead. He hasn't, apparently Trump passed many more bills than Biden has, but Biden came up with that $1.9 trillion plan to benefit almost everybody in the country that needed a little help. And, besides the tax bill, which you were talking about, to me, one of the most important things will be an infrastructure bill that, so much of this country is crumbling and rusting. And, this will benefit people in virtually in every state. So, he's been running fast as far as I can see.
Clyde, one of the things he doesn't seem to be doing is making too many mistakes. We can talk about immigration and the border crisis in a moment, but an article in New York Magazine said Republicans can't stop Biden because he's boring them to death. He's not giving them enough of a reason to attack him. Would you agree with that assessment?
I don't agree he's boring. I agree he's governing. I would disagree with Eleanor only on the point of I frankly did expect him to push full steam ahead because of the limited time that he has to do this. 2 years sounds about right. And also, he's no kid. Obviously, he's going to be 80 at the end of those 2 years. So he's got a lot to do right now. One Republican leader in Congress attacked Biden for his lack of tweeting and saying that suggests he's not in charge. That's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, and just shows how this party has turned itself lock, stock, and pork barrel to some degree into a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump. They've just checked their brains at the door. The man is governing. What more can anybody possibly expect and hope for?
Peter, I saw one figure that when Trump came in his first 100 days, he had about 12 reversals of Obama policies, whether they were through executive orders or other things. Biden has reversed 62. What does that mean? What does that say about the relationship and, again, about his governing style?
Well, I think he wanted, obviously, to show the contrast with President Trump pretty quickly. He wanted to be able to show Americans, particularly the Americans who supported him, that he was going to, bring things back to normal as he perceived it or as he portrays it. The challenge here, though, of course, is we're now into a cycle, 3 presidents in a row, where they're governing more by executive action than they had in the past, using their own power to try to achieve things that they can't get through Congress. And we see, therefore, how quickly that's reversed. And that's, whether you're liberal or conservative, pro-Trump or pro-Biden, what it means is that the changes that are enacted by each new president are temporary rather than sustained, reordering of our system. And that's not necessarily good for business or our adversaries or allies overseas who are looking for some sense of consistency, some sense of continuity between administrations, even despite the change in parties, because you don't have buy-in from Congress. One thing that we see here, I think, with President Biden outlining what arguably could be the most progressive or liberal agenda since LBJ, the difference is that LBJ got it through Congress, which made it part of the fabric of our society. The question is whether Biden can do that. Executive orders come and go. Legislation tends to last.
Is he even trying to do that at this point? The governing by executive order?
Well, these plans that he's outlining in the speech this week, the American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan, those would be long-lasting if they get through. Some of those are significant policy changes that would be, more durable, presumably, if they are changed in Congress. Although, of course, the next Congress could change them if they had the majorities and a friendly face in the White House. It's harder, though. And I think that's why he wants to work as many of these policy changes as he can into these big, giant, massive spending bills, especially, as Eleanor said, in the first few weeks and months of his presidency before he loses. Look, he's got a 50-50 Senate. He could lose that at any moment. You could have a single senator get sick or need to resign or what have you, and suddenly, you don't have a majority anymore. So he's got short amount of time to make what he's hoping are going to be big changes.
Eleanor, you talked about some of the big things on the president's plate: a public works project, childcare, community college tuition, paid family leave. How is he going to get that through a Congress that, as Peter says, is very recalcitrant and where he has to deal with Republican leaders who have been very resistant to Democratic programs?
I don't know how he's going to do it, frankly. I mean, but if anybody can, he knows he can get it through the House. That's really not the problem. But as Peter says, you've got a 50-50 Senate, and you've got Manchin from West Virginia, who is a nervous Nelly all the time. And so it's going to be a very difficult sell in the Senate. But the thing is that Joe Biden comes from the Senate. He knows the rules. He knows what moves senators. And, I can't help but think he could figure out a sort of tit for tat system for, especially, I mentioned infrastructure. That has always been one of the bonuses, if you will. If you are a senator, you can bring things home. And actually, I can imagine Biden negotiating in some way that could get him at least one more vote or two more votes. Not a bridge to nowhere or anything like that, but something that would have the people in Iowa or someplace saying, we really need that. We need those roads. We need those bridges. Come on, let's have it. So, I mean, if anybody can do it, this guy knows the Senate like the back of his hand.
Clyde, we discussed this before, but coming to the issue of how do you pay for all of this, taxes on the wealthy, taxes on corporations. Corporations, big business was very enthusiastic about supporting Black Lives Matter. They were a little slower to come along, as we discussed before, issues like voting rights that arguably a little more political, more sensitive. What are they going to do about taxes, higher taxes now to pay for social programs, even to pay for something as relatively neutral as public works? Are they going to sign on to the Biden program or stick to their usual Republican allies?
Well, they'll stick to the Republican allies, but it is the nature of businesses to resist higher taxes. I expect them to continue to do so. Biden is not asking for the moon, going from maybe 37% or so on corporate taxes to 39%, reversing to some, not reversing fully, but undoing some of the very large tax cuts that Trump and the Republican Congress passed in 2017. These are not asking for the moon kind of issues. It is, from my political point of view, encouraging that they have spoken out on matters like Black Lives Matter and on the restrictive voting laws recently voted in Georgia and are making their way through other state legislatures. But in the end, the bottom line for business is the bottom line. And so I expect resistance to continue, whether it will be very strong or half-hearted, I have no way of knowing. But I do not think they became socialists while we were asleep last night.
I think that's a good guess. Peter, we talked about immigration earlier as being a stumble, or at least immigration on the border. What is the president going to do about that? And why were they caught short on that issue?
Well, that's a great question. In fact, it has been one of the few areas in the first 100 days where they have been caught off guard, not able to respond as nimbly as you might hope. They have, there is a seasonal uptick at this time of year in the migration, but even then, this is higher than we've seen in a number of years, according to Biden's own DHS. And so what he's done is he's put his Vice President Kamala Harris in charge of that. She's been in contact with Central American, Mexican leadership to talk about what they can do on their side of the border. Not much of a gift from the president to the vice president to say, hey, here's a nice hot potato, you take charge of it. But it's thrown him a little for a loop. It's one reason why he kind of reversed himself and then re-reversed himself on the refugee cap, because he was, I think, sensitive to the political backlash of the crisis at the border at this point and didn't want to be seen as contributing further to it. Then suddenly, of course, he got a backlash on the other side saying, wait a second, you made a promise on refugee cap. How can you suddenly renege on that? So it's been one of the few areas, I think, where he has not shown, a steady foot. He's going to have to figure out what to do about that. But in the meantime, he's given Republicans a lot of ammunition. It's been a favorite talking point for his opponents at this point.
Has he made any other mistakes, or is that it so far?
Well, obviously, you can make an argument about that. He has not had the kind of sort of stumbling first 100 days that, say, Bill Clinton had. Bill Clinton had a really rocky first 100 days. He had a number of problems with his early nominations. He went forward on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It became Don't Ask, Don't Tell in a faltering way. took him a while to get his feet planted. As Eleanor pointed out, as Clyde says, basically this is a president who knows Washington, so he didn't make those kind of rookie mistakes that Bill Clinton did, and he didn't do the kinds of things that Donald Trump did, in which Trump was trying to sort of upend the system from his first 100 days. But that doesn't necessarily tell us that much. I mean, remember, the first 100 days is a nice, good thing for us, the media, to kind of take stock. But they don't necessarily tell you how a presidency will turn out. If you look at the first 100 days, for instance, of George W. Bush's presidency, you would not have understood what his 8 years would have ultimately turned out to be about, right? I mean, because we didn't have 9/11 at that point. We didn't know where we were going to go on foreign policy. The first 100 days was interesting, but not in that sense all that revelatory.
Eleanor, you covered Russia, you've covered Washington. What is Vladimir Putin up to? What is he testing the president about? And how far is he willing to go?
Watching what Putin is doing in Ukraine is, for me, it's terrifying. This man is a bully. He's the heir to the Soviets. People in Russia still love Stalin. You have to remember that. And it's just, Putin really knows that the strong man, the fist instead of the gloved fist, that is what people respect. His people respect. What we're starting to see is people pushing back in Russia, and that's what the Navalny. If Navalny dies, the pressure on Putin will become very intense. And what people think will happen then is that he will have some activity outside of Russia to sort of deflect from his failures there to protect Navalny. But you know what? Biden knows all this, and he's not. For those of us who know Russia, watching Trump cave to Putin all the time was absolutely terrifying. At least Biden actually knows the lay of the land there, and knows that Putin is not, a lovable guy with a warm heart, as W said at some point.
Every time you mention Putin and strongman and Stalin, I'm reminded of the Woody Allen line that the Russian Revolution began when the people realized that the Tsar and the Tsar were the same person. Clyde, let me ask you about something else that's striking is bipartisanship. One of the reasons that the president isn't doing as well as some of his predecessors in the polls is the big gap between how Republicans and Democrats perceive him. He has a 93% approval rating among Democrats, a 12% approval rating among Republicans. How does he bridge a gap like that? That's enormous.
It is enormous, but I would say it's not just a gap about how they perceive this president. It's about how they perceive the world, how they perceive the country and who we are in 2021. There is virtually no overlap. The Venn diagrams, of circles overlapping. Well, the areas of overlap are exceedingly small these days. You see it a little bit perhaps in the latest impeachment of Donald Trump, but by and large, when you have a situation where a country is in sore need of relief with that $1.9 trillion bill, and you get no Republicans at all, including so-called moderates, you have to begin to wonder, is there any bridge to be built between the two? I would like a world in which Joe Manchin does not decide national policy, which at the moment he does to some degree, since if the Democrats lose him, they're in serious trouble. But the fact that we talk past each other, when I say we, I mean Americans, depending on which party, even down to the question of wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. Okay, the rules have now changed yet again under the new CDC guidelines, but why even something like that should be a cultural war issue is beyond me. but it was, and it remains so, and there'll be many, many more of these, as there already have been. It goes beyond Joe Biden, to me, Sam. It deals with who we perceive we are as Americans, and whether or not we accept a lot of unfamiliar faces, shall we say, as Americans. And this is going to go on for a while, I fear.
Peter, following up on that very question, what does the president do about, as we mentioned earlier, reconciling the issue of public safety and racial sensitivity? These are two big issues he's had to face. He doesn't want to offend the police. He wants to show that he's sensitive to the issues of racial justice. How does he, as a federal official, deal with both of those and show some balance and show that he's willing to do something substantive rather than just talk about it?
Yeah, it's a good question because there's obviously limits on what he can do. He did run on this issue, of course, in the fall following the George Floyd killing, murder, and other incidents. It was a big issue in the fall, and he promised to address it. So far, the main thing that he and his administration have done, he's left the Justice Department and Attorney General Merrick Garland to reopen what they call pattern and practice investigations, the kind of thing that the Trump administration generally didn't do, where the federal government comes in and looks at a police department, say in Louisville, and says, okay, are you actually, what is the sum total of how you're doing your policing? Are you in fact doing it in a race neutral way? Are you in fact targeting people of color? What kind of training needs to be done? What kind of hiring needs to be done, recruiting and so forth? What kind of discipline and accountability? So that's the main thing that Biden has done on this. Beyond that, he's chosen not so far to try to use the executive actions we were talking about earlier to try to do anything. And he's waiting for Congress to see if they might be able to come up with any kind of bipartisan agreement here. Now, the House, under the Democrats, passed the George Floyd Justice Act a year ago. Only Democrats, not a Republican bill, but Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, has been in talks with Karen Bass, the Democratic congresswoman from California. There's some hope that they might be able to put together some kind of a bipartisan compromise. Biden was letting them try that first before he does anything further with executive action.
Eleanor, you've been covering the census a great deal over the past couple of years. The figures came out this past week of what it portends for the next 10 years. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's my understanding that the state of New York lost a member of Congress by 89 census votes, 89 people who did not fill out their census forms.
That's incredible.
It is incredible. And so, I mean, you've already seen the person who ran the census, Julie Menon, blaming the governor, and the governor now is suing or trying to figure out how to sue the federal government over this. But mainly what has happened is what has been happening for a long time, and that is that the population seems to be moving to the south. You have, I think, Texas gaining, Florida gaining. Oddly, the one thing that really surprised me in the whole census thing was California losing congressional seat. That seemed very strange and odd to me. What you hear from the people who worked on the census was that the Trump people made everything more difficult this time, and that they felt that the whole process of trying to find people and trying to get people to fill out their forms was in many ways intentionally made more complicated. And that is one of the reasons that so many of the blue states seem to lose congressional seats.
Clyde, let me ask you about a question closer to home. David Axelrod said the first 100 days is sort of like a Hallmark holiday, the kind of things that doesn't really count for anything. People seem to be saying that at this point about the mayoral race in New York. Michael Wilson had a story in the Times the other day saying just that. Why don't they care? Obviously, there are a lot of other things to care about. And when are they going to start caring? And when they do, what are they going to care about?
I suspect that 75% of them won't care at all. I mean, de Blasio won election twice with roughly 23% of the electorate actually voting. So New York's turnouts are notoriously and disgracefully low historically. And so there's no reason why it should be different. Plus, there are something like 13 people on the ballot, and that's got to confuse a lot of them. And this is not 1977 with a lot of super names on it. There are a lot of talented people, but it's not quite the same. And then there's the introduction of Andrew Yang. And is he a flash in the pan? What does he bring to the table? Nobody really knows for sure. My curiosity is, after 4 years of Donald Trump, somebody who had no experience in politics whatsoever, never held any public office, are New Yorkers going to do the same and install somebody as mayor who's never had to deal with a legislature, a city council, various department heads, and all the other headaches that go with governing? We shall see. But not tuning in until the very end is sort of a New York tradition, so it doesn't surprise me. And there's the complication of the pandemic, and there's the complication that we now have ranked choice voting. And that has not been fully explained to a lot of people.
Exactly. Well, we hope people do tune in at least a day or two before the end.
Hopefully.
Thanks to Peter Baker, Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.